Hi there, and welcome to the latest episode of Off the Data Provided. I am, of course, your host, Dr. Marcus C. Shepard. On today's episode, we're going to talk about a new article from the Institute of Family Study entitled The Sex Recession, The Share of Americans Having Regular Sex Keeps Dropping by Grant Bailey and Brad Wilcox. There won't be any key terms or words per se today, but I do believe that this article highlights a lot of what we've been discussing in previous episodes of the podcast regarding a lack of communication skills, declining interpersonal communication interactions, as well as a generational shift of communication and interpersonal relationships due mainly to technology. Also, make sure that you stay tuned until the end, where I'll give some helpful tips about making new friends as the semester kicks off for a lot of students. So diving into the Institute of Family Studies article, The Sex Recession, The Share of Americans Having Regular Sex Keeps Dropping, Americans are having a record low amount of sex. So according to the General Social Survey, they found that in 1990, 55% of adults between the age of 18 and 64 reported having sex regularly. But around the turn of the millennium, that dipped a bit. And by 2010, less than half of respondents reported having sex weekly. And by 2024, out of the 1,000 men and women who were interviewed on the topic by the GSS, the General Social Survey, the number had fallen to just 37%. So essentially, in the span of 34 years, we went from 55% of adults 18 to 64 having sex regularly to 37%. Now, what I do find interesting about this, and I poked around a bit on the general survey, wasn't fully able to understand, is what is their definition of sex? So I think whenever I talk about sex, especially with my students in my interpersonal communication course, we also have to make sure we have the same baseline understanding of what sex is. And I always joke with them about how when I'm having sex talk with my friends, and just a reminder, sex talk is conversations that are more so about the actual act of sex. So when we're having sex talk, when we're talking about things that we've done or things that we want to do, or would we count this as sex or would we not, what's always fascinating is most people define sex as penetrative sex. So, of course, if that is our only baseline definition, I'm not shocked that it's been declining. But if we also include oral sex, we also include other sexual acts as part of sex, right? Other things you might do intimately, then it is peculiar to me that it has dropped so drastically in 35 years. But of course, we know that part of this is a decline is due to partnership, and especially the lack of couples that are being formed. So in an earlier episode entitled The Relationship Recession, we highlighted how coupling, just even getting in committed romantic relationships, has drastically fallen over the last 30 years. And so I know firsthand in my own courses, I've had to slowly but surely start changing assignments that look at romantic relationships, because even though I do have students who fall clearly into the 18 to 64 demographic, and sometimes I have older students, sometimes I have some younger students, a lot of students, I would say, or not a lot, a fair share of students have never been in a committed romantic relationship. And so some of my assignments would ask you to pull real life examples to underscore theories. And so now I offer that you can pull from a favorite TV show or movie, but you need to provide context so that I understand exactly what you're talking about. But I've seen this shift literally over the last 5 or so years, even before the pandemic began. And so because partnered adults have more consistent sex and more younger men and women are flying solo, as they would say, the share of young adults who are having regular sex keeps falling. So when it comes to sexlessness, so that's being defined as no sex in the last year. So I would argue that's no penetrative or no oral sex or no very intimate aspects where there is an ejaculation or an orgasm. among young adults, the biggest change actually comes post 2010. So prior to 2010, the share of young adults, so that's going to be 18 to 29, who reported not having sex held at around 15%. But between 2010, oh, did I say that right? 2010, right? And 2024, the share actually doubled from 12% to 24% per that General Social Survey. And so what's interesting about this, and I think we can understand this through Haidt's The Anxious Generation, where this period between 2010 and 2015, he calls this the Great Rewiring. And so adolescents who were going through puberty during this time were subject to a change in how they grew up. So the pervasiveness of digital media really kicks off with the majority of people having smartphones, apps, and this all happens in the late 2000s into the 2010s, clearly. And children become increasingly digital, right? Their childhoods are digital. They're not necessarily outside all the time building those social skills. They're not involved in a lot of activities that the traditional maybe child was. So for instance, dating myself, of course, I know growing up, didn't have any type of electronics. I had a video game, the N64, but that was kind of something I'd play on weekends, but would also play with friends. It'd be an outlet. But in addition to playing that game, we'd also go outside and play tag or run around, shoot basketball. We'd all play soccer. Some would try tennis. There was a tennis court not too far. So we were very active. We'd ride our bikes. We'd just hang out, watch TV, do all that. We didn't have phones. So we were fully, or I would say more so present than maybe a lot of children and even adults are now, where even if you are hanging out with people, you sometimes have your phone and you're looking at it. So we know that they're missing out on a lot of these early socialization skills, as we've talked about before. A lot of students share with me sometimes that they're taking my interpersonal communication course so that they can actually learn and build these skills because they don't know them. They went to school, they have a cell phone, they text people, but they really lack the ability to have in-person, face-to-face conversation. And I think we're seeing that slowly but surely change as a generation. So I know I'm famous for when I'm out shopping, I'll ask people who work at the store how they're doing, how's the day, has it been busy? And a lot of times they're shocked by that because most of us are guilty of doing kind of browsing around the store, but on our phones, scrolling, texting, maybe actually taking a phone call. And so we're not really giving interpersonal communication at all to these people. We're doing kind of the impersonal communication, where we're treating people more so like an object, as we've talked about before, and less so like a person. So we can see that if this is how you are being socialized as a child, you're not seeing those skills because your parents maybe aren't actually flexing those skills. They're not teaching you those skills. The whole society is built around these devices that we carry in our pockets. Where were they going to learn the ability to strike up a conversation, to flirt? A lot of that has now been pushed onto apps. And of course, these apps are supposed to be age restricted. So you're not supposed to be on these apps until you're 18. So how are you going to learn how to date, quote unquote, before 18 if you're missing out on these socialization aspects? And so we know that the digital media revolution kind of left in its wake increases in anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide, especially for these younger adults. So clearly, this lack of socialization is a huge issue, and people have pushed that. Of course, COVID has made it worse. The lockdowns that we all experienced that really weren't actually as long as people believe them to be actually caused this, but the data paints a different story. So between 2010 and 2019, we saw a drastic decline in the amount of time that young adults spent with friends in a given week. So it fell by basically 50%. So in 2010, the average young adult, so 18 to 29, would spend an average of 12.8 hours per week with their friends. At 2019, this is clearly before 2020 and COVID and the lockdowns, it had already fallen to 6.5 hours per week. And so, of course, the pandemic did push this number even lower to 4.2 hours a week. And there has been a slight increase, it seems, but with the most recent GSS survey, young adults spend about 5.1 hours with friends in a given week, according to 2024. So, of course, there's more time devoted to smartphones, to social media, to gaming, to dating sites, and less time developing these face-to-face social skills needed to form relationships and to create and foster long-term interpersonal relationships. Clearly, there's a crisis. As I always say, because of these things, I'll always have a job because my job is to teach these communication skills to help people become more adept and better and more confident and comfortable. And so clearly, one part is definitely the social skills, and that's, I think, where I excel in my teaching, in my research areas, and helping give people these tools that can work. But as I always stress, interpersonal communication is context, content, and communicator specific. So what that, of course, means, as we've said before, is that what might work with one friend, let's say if you're having conflict, might not work with another friend. And I've shared examples before. Share a quick one now, right? My friend Janine, we're very straight, no chaser with each other. If I have an issue or problem with her, I just tell her directly. Where my primo Jaime, he doesn't like straight, no chaser. He needs me to butter him up, ease him into the issue. And so that's where we highlight that social skills. So when you have those social skills, you're able to identify that and you're able to change how you approach your communication with different people. We've talked about that concept of cognitive complexity and person-centeredness. So the higher your cognitive complexity, the ability to identify that everyone is not the same, the higher your person-centeredness is, your ability to maneuver those situations. So, of course, if you take my courses, or hopefully as you've been listening to this podcast, you've been picking out some of these skills and these tips and these tricks. And I hope that they help you become better with your interpersonal communication. But that, of course, is just one side of it. And the other side is people spending less time in social settings that would facilitate these relationships. So clearly, as a young adult, most people go off to college or attend a local college. Not as many people. We've also seen that slowly declining. But that is kind of a playground per se where you hopefully foster these skills. But of course, with the lockdown that happened, people weren't in school. They were taking school at home. You don't have that ability to really foster those connections, to work on those skills, to apply the theory that you maybe are learning in your interpersonal communication class or other communication courses. And so people are also spending less time in parties, at bars. We know that the consumption of alcohol, especially for this younger generation, is declining. And some of that, of course, people don't want to talk about it, but as someone who's versed also in literature around COVID, is also due to people having long COVID. And one of those potential symptoms is an alcohol intolerance. So clearly you can't handle your liquor anymore. You're not going to want to drink it anymore because it makes you very sick. And so we're seeing that decline a lot because unfortunately we've thrown these younger generations to the wolves when it comes to COVID and not making things as safe. So I know I'm very COVID conscious, so I personally avoid a lot of social settings because I do know that the indoor air quality is not great. And so with high CO2 in different areas, the increase of catching a respiratory virus increases drastically. So clearly that's a little tangent, but we know that people are spending less time in these social situations where you can randomly meet people, and then people lack these social skills. So this is a huge issue that is clearly impacting people, and these impacts lead to the sensationalization of the title that we have a sex recession, right? The share of Americans having regular sex keeps dropping. Of course, it's going to drop if you don't have the skills to foster a relationship to eventually engage in sex. That's a no-brainer. You're spending less time with people in general. How are you going to meet people? So a lot of people are meeting online. And as we've talked about before, sometimes the apps can be a good space to engage, especially if you're just looking for casual sex, because you can make it known. You can be very plain in your language. You can be very quid pro quo about it. But we have to be honest that a lot of people aren't looking just for casual sex. They're looking for relationships. They're looking for committed romantic partnerships. They're looking to be coupled and eventually married. But because the rise of unmarried individuals is happening, the rise in lack of couples and coupling and relationships is rising, it's no brainer. It's not a shocker that we're seeing a decline in young adults, especially this is, of course, all in American context, having less sex. So what are some of the remedies? How can we fix or cure this, right? As an academic, a lot of times we're focused more so on the root of the problem, identifying the problem and letting you know what it is, and saying, hey, if we can fix this problem, right? Of course, with, regular sex, we know from the Institute of Family Studies that it's linked to better health, higher quality of marriage if you're married, and of course, greater happiness. Also, it's linked to better physical outcomes, usually, of course, better health. So we are social creatures, right? And how can we fix this? So first and foremost, I think what's important is people put down your phones. Challenge yourself for that. So I know I have an iPhone, and the iPhone will give you an update about how much time you're on your phone. And I know that some of these phones now, you can either download apps that limit your phone usage, that will literally not let you access it, or they have settings that will cap you at how much time you can spend on apps per day. So I think for people who are struggling with using their phones a lot, I think that is a great way to maybe start this or to challenge yourself. It's a new month, or any time really is perfect to take on something new. I know some people always talk about you don't have to wait to the new year to start something new. Start now. You don't have to wait. But if you are someone who likes to wait, well, it is the beginning of September, or you're a college student, right? It's the beginning of a semester. Maybe you challenge yourself to limiting your phone usage. I know for me that when I go out in public, I'm very much hear no, see no, speak no when I dress. So I usually always have headphones on. I have sunglasses on. Of course, I have my N95 mask on. And so usually that deters people from interacting with me. But I do have a aura or disposition, some might say, that is friendly. So I know when I'm out and about, sometimes people will comment on my outfit, or I'll, of course, offer compliments or comments on people like, oh, I love your hair. I love your outfit. Those are cute shoes. And that is a great way just to slowly but surely test out a skill of just light conversation, that social snacking. Strangers, this last week, I have new Power Ranger shorts that I've been wearing, and I've gotten multiple compliments on them. And the compliments we engaged in brief banter, right? I said, oh, thank you. I said, are you a fan of Power Rangers to one person? They said, yes. I said, well, who's your favorite Ranger? They told me. I shared mine. I said, oh, did you see the Netflix special? I think it was 2 years ago that they did, and they had not. I told them they should check it out, and that was it, right? I moved on, went about my day. Now, if I was someone that was looking for friends, or maybe if I found that person physically attractive and was interested, there would have maybe been a way to talk a little more, maybe exchange information somehow. But literally, it all starts with just something small. So I think those two things are a great way to begin that. And then you can also think about, what is the quality of time I'm spending with the people that I'm around currently? So as we talked about before, friendship, spending time with friends is declining vastly for young adults. And clearly, of course, for regular adults, I would argue. I'd love to see some data on that. So think about the quality of time. Am I on my phone constantly while I'm hanging out with my friends? Okay, if I am, how can I change that? Can I plan things where it's focused on us doing something together and talking about that thing? So I know I have some card conversation games that ask you intimate questions, and I think it's a great way that I get to know some of my friends better, because these are maybe questions I wouldn't necessarily ask them in regular everyday conversation, but they're fascinating questions that lead to different tangents, that lead to opening up about past experiences. And so sometimes creating a game like that, you don't even need to buy one. You can write these questions or go online and look up thought-provoking questions or getting to know you questions to maybe foster more intimacy amongst your friends so you don't feel as lonely or as isolated. So I thought that article was pretty fascinating, pretty interesting. I think it highlights, as I said before, aspects that we've talked about on the podcast about how technology is really changing how we communicate, how there's just a decline in interpersonal communication interactions or in events, because we don't do interpersonal communication with everybody, right? I think there's a misconception, as we talked about, I believe, on our first episode ever of the podcast, where we talked about the interpersonal communication continuum. And we literally know that a lot of people believe that anytime they have a communication or a conversation with somebody, sometimes they label that as interpersonal communication. But interpersonal communication is a selective process that allows people the ability to create, build, and reflect on one another. And what's really important here is that it's selective, because you don't choose to engage with it with just anyone. And it's a process because it evolves over time and it becomes more personal as you continue to interact. So I think about my interactions with close friends. When we first were getting to know each other, we clearly weren't as intimate or as comfortable, right? There were some nerves, there was some anxiety, there were maybe long pauses or maybe not long pauses. We were trying to fill up all the space and air. But as we've gotten more comfortable, confident, and continue to communicate with one another, that process has become more intimate, right? I know more about the person, right? I feel more confident, more comfortable. So sometimes I might say something that maybe a few years before I wouldn't have felt comfortable saying to that person. And so that continuum, right, impersonal to interpersonal, that I, it to I, thou communication. So figure out how you can have more I, thou communication with these people with these people who are in your life. I think that is what I took from this article, that clearly we have a skills issue. Clearly technology has really impacted us here. And there is a big opportunity to remedy this. Yes, partially maybe using that technology to help fix that, but also getting away from the technology and getting more comfortable in our face-to-face environments. Go to the park. Strike up a conversation with a stranger. Talk to somebody at the grocery store. I remember growing up, my mom would chat with a lot of people at the grocery store and she wouldn't even really know who they are. Someone might see something in our cart and they say, "Where'd you get that?" Or, "Oh, what are you making?" And a whole conversation would sprout up. Or you're waiting in line and you see what the person has on their conveyor belt and you're like, "Oh, I like that snack too." And you can have a little tangent. Those things don't happen anymore. When someone's in the line, you're on your phone. If you're walking through the aisles, you're on your phone. We're missing this social snacking that can build and hopefully get rid of some of that anxiety that people have when it comes to engaging with strangers. So that's what I took from that article. And so now we're going to move to Ask Dr. Shepard. So the Ask Dr. Shepard for this week comes from actually a former student of mine. And of course, if you want to submit an Ask Dr. Shepard, feel free to email me at offthedataprovided@gmail.com. Once again, that is offthedataprovided@gmail.com. So the email went, "Hi, Dr. Shepard, former student here, and I've always had a difficult time making friends in class. When I took your class, I felt like I became friendly with a few students in my group, but I'm worried as a new semester begins at a new school how I can make friends. I know your course in particular stress group work and engaging with classmates regularly, but a lot of my courses do not seem to be about that this semester. Any suggestions would be greatly appreciated." So thank you to my former student. It was not signed, and your email address does not give away who this was. So I appreciate that you hopefully enjoyed my class, and clearly you're listening to the podcast. So thank you so much. When it comes to making friends in classes, what I've always found is who you sit around, especially those first few days, right? We all usually get locked into this is our seats. Chat those people up a little bit before class. Maybe exchange emails if you feel comfortable not giving your number. If you don't feel comfortable giving your number, emails. So what I always did in classes when I was taking classes is we would exchange some type of contact information just in case I was going to miss class, or they were going to miss class, so I could get notes. So you kind of couch it in that, which of course it is. And then slowly but surely, maybe you can foster hanging out before class, hanging out after class, doing a study group, right? In a study group, you're not going to spend the entire time studying. There are going to be breaks. There are going to be moments where you talk about your personal life, or you can, and you can get to know these people. And so fostering that even in courses that aren't built around you fostering commitments, right? So in my courses, all of them, I make students do some type of group work or get to know their classmates in a sense. And I used to require them to exchange contact information with at least 2 students. I don't do that anymore. But in some of them, right, you're placing groups, so you do have to exchange information. And that is really just the beginning. So of course, if your professor is not providing those opportunities to do so, you're going to have to take a little step out and some initiative and do some of these things. So of course, usually the first day there's icebreakers or introductions. So maybe you heard from some people and you found them a little interesting or fascinating, or maybe they have the same major or similar interests as you. So I would maybe chat them up a little bit before class. Just, hey, how was your weekend? Do anything fun? Hey, I might be missing class in a week or two. Would you mind if we exchange emails, and maybe you could email me your notes? If small things like that. And hey, if you miss something, I can definitely provide you the notes. Hey, do you want to study for the midterm together? Depending on when the course meets, do you want to grab a snack or grab lunch after? And these things can slowly but surely build to having a friendship. We talked about that's kind of a nascent friendship, right? It's festering, it's building, but depending on your investment and the other person's investment, we'll see if it takes off. Now, of course, you could do all of this and they're not receptive, and that's just life, unfortunately. But I would argue that other people are clamoring and interested in connection as well. As we clearly see from the data, more and more people are spending less and less time with each other and are feeling isolated, are becoming hermits. I know I'm a homebody, but I am very much a social homebody. So I will have people over. I will be on the phone for hours. I will be FaceTiming. I will do all of these very social things just from the comfort of my house. So definitely feel people out with these different aspects and see how it goes. You also might come to find that, especially in college, depending on what your major is, there'll be people who are always going to be in your class because usually it's the only one offered and you have to take it as a major. Sometimes there's only one section. And so if you see people constantly in your classes, this is maybe a good indication that you guys have some similar interests and can hopefully build a friendship from that. It might not be a long-term friendship. As we've talked about before, we have friends for a reason, a season, and a lifetime. So maybe the reason is just for the class. Maybe the season is just college, or it could be a lifetime friend, right? I know I went to school and there were some people who literally were just friends because we had the same classes. And when semesters ended and we were all done with coursework, and clearly I graduated, they graduated, we don't talk anymore. If I see them at a reunion, it's no harm, no foul, but we're just not close, and that's okay. So I would say definitely chat people up a little bit before class. Sometimes people get there a little early, or sometimes there's a little downtime in class. So hopefully if you paid attention to those icebreakers or people sharing things, figure out who you can exchange that information with, maybe build a study group. And then from there, see if people want to hang out in a less of a classroom environment. So maybe it's at the dining hall. Maybe it's at a fast food restaurant off campus that you guys can grab a quick bite. Just feel people out, and hopefully that will work. Additionally, I know that there are clubs at every school, and so clubs are also a great way to create friendships. A lot of times people are just focused on going to school, getting their degree, and going home. But if you are feeling lonely, I would look up on your website of whatever institution you are at now what type of clubs they have, and usually they'll have a contact information for the club. I would contact them and figure out when they meet, reach out, attend, and make a friend that way as well. So that is our episode for the week. Nothing too long, hopefully, for you. I hope you enjoy it, and I will see you on the next one.